As Nick mentioned, we started last week this conversation. We're talking about the book of Colossians and we're walking through it. One of the things we really like to do is take a book of the Bible and just walk really section by section, sometimes verse by verse, really looking at the primary themes and trying to understand and unpack it as we walk through it. And we're doing that with a book called Colossians in the New Testament. If you weren't here last week, we kicked it off. We kicked it off by talking about the fact that this is not just a book that was written, but it was actually a letter that was sent to a church. And what's fascinating about this letter and about other letters that we read, in fact, all of the New Testament, this is what we see. What's fascinating is that when we look and see when the gospel goes into a community, or when the gospel penetrates a culture, or when the gospel becomes a part of somebody's life or a neighborhood, or whatever the context is, when the gospel is suddenly a part of whatever that context is transformed. It changes. There is transformation that takes place in the lives of individuals and the community. Things begin to shift and take on a different shape because of the gospel. And one of the primary things that we see happening throughout the New Testament is that there is a freedom that people experience when they come in contact with the gospel. The truth is that as much as we long for freedom, and we talk about this all the time, as much as we long for freedom, as much as we desire to be free, the reality is that we are not free. We live in bondage. We can tell by our behaviors, we tell by the actions that we have to carry out every week, the fact that we have to have a schedule the way we have our schedule. The reality is the way we live our life, at some point when everything gets quiet and we have enough time to reflect, we all recognize that as much as we want to be free, seldom do we actually experience true senses of freedom. Humanity, we feel it, we experience it. We have moments when we go, man, I don't really feel free. I feel restricted. I feel like I'm in bondage to these sorts of things. When we look at the book of Colossians and we walk through this letter, one of the things that we're seeing is how this church at Colossae encountered the gospel, and then how the gospel set them free relative to the things in our culture and our society that typically bind us, the things that restrict us, the things that really do genuinely take our freedom. We get to see them walk this out. Now, the natural condition of humanity is emptiness. We're empty. When we're born, and we get the little gift basket of welcome to humanity, inside of it is this empty box, and it says, this is your life. You're empty. Like we are empty. Humanity, we have this void inside of us. We have this spiritual void, this emotional void. We have this void inside of us, and we live our lives, humanity in general, lives their lives in an effort to try to fill that void. We do all kinds of things to try to make that emptiness go away. We run after all sorts of ideas and pursuits, but one of the primary ways we try to resolve that emptiness is through establishing a sense of self-importance. That's how we try to resolve this. We think in ourselves, if I feel empty, then I have to make myself more meaningful as a person. And so we live under this illusion that we are competent to run our own lives. Or we believe this illusion that we need to achieve some sort of sense of meaning and purpose that will eventually alleviate that. That if I can do enough things and really establish myself and rise above my peers and the people around me, that eventually then I'll be esteemed enough, not just in their eyes, but in my own eyes, that I'll have this feeling sort of dissipate and be resolved inside of me. So we do all of these things. We try to live our lives a particular way, trying to establish ourselves as being something. We want a sense of worth, and we attach that worth to so many different pursuits in our life. We want to be special. We want to be unique. If you've ever read any C.S. Lewis, his book, Mere Christianity, there's a fascinating quote along these lines. I just want to share it with you. This is interesting. Talking about our pursuit, our pride, our sense of self-worth. This is what Lewis said. He said, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next person. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good-looking, but they're not. They're proud of being richer or cleverer or better looking than others. If everyone else became equally rich or clever or good looking, there would be nothing left to be proud about. Isn't there some truth in that? I mean, the reality is what we look for is a sense of self-importance. We try to put ourselves above other people, and when we finally feel like, well, I've made it, or I'm big enough, or I'm important enough, then somehow we start finding some identity in that sort of thing. This is essentially how you could boil it down. You could say it this way. We like to think that we are a big deal. Plain and simple. We like to think that we are a big deal. There's just something about it. It feels good when we feel like we're a big deal. Case in point, I had a little moment this last week. And actually, the moment was this last week, but the interesting thing happened a couple weeks ago. I almost became that guy. My wife, we were talking sometimes on Fridays. We just have Fridays to kind of hang out. And we were hanging out on a Friday a few weeks ago, and she goes, you know something? I think you need to buy a new suit. And I was like, why? I don't wear suits very often, and I got a couple suits I like. Why? And she goes, it's just time. It's been a while. It wasn't until I bought a suit that I found out why, because then she's just like gushing. She's like, yeah, your suits are horrible. You're dated. They don't fit you well. They're awkward. But at the beginning of this conversation, it was just, I think it's just time that you got a new suit. And later on, the truth comes out. He was just like slow playing me. But we decided, okay, we're going to do it. So this last week, we decided to go find a suit. And so we go to this first place. First place is not necessarily known for their suits. It's not reputable about being the place you buy suits. But years ago, one of the outdated suits that my wife doesn't like, I got there and I liked it. So I was like, well, can we start at this place? And so we go there, and they're not known for suits. They're not known for, extraordinary customer service. It's kind of just an average store, but it's a place that I like to go. So we go there, and the person that was helping me was so amazing at her job. Like, first of all, someone else was helping me, and that person went home, so they passed me on to this other person. Somehow, I don't know where in the mix, she got my name, and so she calls out over the changing stall thing, which is always awkward when you're a guy, because then you hear like a woman's voice, you're like, stay out? Like, what's going on? Why? Go. But anyway, she goes, hey, Brad, my name's so-and-so. I'm here to help you, da-da-da-da-da. So, okay, great. Get the suit on, step out. There's the mirror. I'm looking at myself. She's standing there. She starts coming. Okay, I think you could do this. And she's being so helpful. She's like, she's being complimentary. This is literally, I'm standing there. Pretty soon, I'm like, this suit does look good, right? Like, the more you talk, the better this suit looks. Like, I feel really good. And so literally, like, pretty soon I'm like, you're my friend, and this is the best suit that's ever been made, right? Like, this could be gold-plated at this point. And so I'm looking at myself, I'm feeling good. Sherry likes it. Like, everything was good. And she made me feel like I was the most important person in her world. Great customer service, right? Great customer service. She made me feel like I was a big deal. Now, not a big enough deal to buy the suit right then and there. I'm smart enough when I'm hunting, which men don't shop, we hunt. And when I'm hunting, I go looking. I'm not going to take this down until I know that I can, what if there's something better? And so we go to this other store that is very reputable for its suits and its service, and it's very well known for being a great place of customer service. And I had this interesting moment. I walk in, we walk over to the area where the suits are, and as I'm approaching it, maybe this happens to you, as I'm approaching it, I started to get kind of nervous, like intimidated nervous. Do you know what I mean? You ever do that? You ever walk in a store and you're like, okay, I'm out of my league right now, right? You ever do that? So I'm walking and I'm getting over there, but no one's really around, so I'm kind of checking a few things out, kind of walking. I'm like, okay, I like this. Pretty soon, salesman comes over, and in a very aloof sort of way, he starts offering some help. And so we begin to exchange some information. I tell him the size. We go to this one spot. We pull out this suit, and I'm like, ooh, that does look good, until I flip the price tag over. And I'm like, no wonder it looks so good. So then I just casually, like literally, this is twice the price of the other suit that I was thinking of. And so I thought, I'm not going to pay that. So didn't say that out loud, but I just kind of flipped the price back over, and I said, I wasn't thinking of spending that much money, and, do you have other things like this? And he goes, let me check, and I'll be back. And so he wanders off. Now leaving Sherry and I for that awkward, like all I'm doing is flipping price tags. Nope. Like, wow, people pay this, I'm just like dying. So we're like hanging out. After a little while, like nothing. And I'm like, you know what? This is hopeless. We just need to go somewhere else. So I said, hey, let's go check out a couple other places. So we start to walk. As we walk, we round the corner, we see he didn't go look for anything. He went to go help another customer. He's happily like behind the counter now. He and I make eye contact, and there's this awkward moment when I realize and he realizes, you dogged me. Like, you dogged me. You thought he's cheap. I'm not going to help him. You went and helped somebody else. Like, I knew what was going on. So, maybe not a big deal, except that even last night, I'm laying in bed last night, a couple days later, I'm laying in bed last night. Here's what I thought. I should write a letter. I should write a letter. I mean, they're supposed to be known for their customer service. People write books about them, and that was the worst service. And, somebody needs to know, like, I'm a big deal, I'm like, you didn't treat me like I was a big deal. And while I'm at it, I thought about taking out an ad in the Spokesman and just saying, like, Brad's also a big jerk, and he's arrogant. But that, why do I do this? Why is there this moment of anxiety, just like, what's going on? Why do I want to write a letter? Why is this sort of thing stirring inside of me? It's stirring inside of me because one of the ways I'm trying to fill this void, this emptiness, is through a sense of self-importance. And so when I've just had an experience where somebody has elevated my sense of my importance, followed with a moment when somebody treated me like I was everybody else, I'm upset, right? Because we do that. We do that sort of thing. We want a sense of importance. We want to be a big deal. We want to feel like we matter. We want to feel like in the comparison game, somebody will say, well, at least you're above that person. Like, we want to be able to look down and see that there's somebody behind us or not as funny as us or somebody that's uglier than us or whatever it is. We just don't want to be the last one in line, right? We do that sort of thing. That's how we behave. We behave that way because of this void. We want a sense of importance. And what I realize in the moments when I'm thinking about writing a letter, when I think about the moments, and these moments when you want to fight for whatever it is that just came up, you realize you're not free. You're in bondage to those things. Our sense of self-importance doesn't free us. It actually holds us captive. And what we're going to look at in Colossians this morning as we continue on, the beginning of Colossians, as Paul is opening this letter to the church at Colossae, what Paul talks about speaks right to the heart of this issue. And what he presents is so relevant to this idea of our own self-importance that we absolutely cannot miss what he has to say. So if you have your Bible, I want you to open up to Colossians chapter 1. If you don't have your Bible, the words will be on the screen. But I want to read this. We're going to read through kind of the first section, the first few verses. And I just want you to listen. I want you to absorb it. I want you to think about how this and what's being said addresses this issue of self-importance. This is what Paul says. He's speaking about Jesus to this church, and he says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he's the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross." Paul speaking of Jesus to this group of people. The gospel is now becoming a part of their lives, and he begins to speak of the supremacy, the preeminence of Jesus. He has created all things. He literally says, by him, all things were created. All things were created. He is before all things, and in him, all things hold together. I think it's important that we pause at this moment and we realize the audaciousness of this claim of Paul. He is literally saying that everything that you and I experience in this world, everything visible and everything invisible, that Jesus has created it, that he is before it, he created it, he holds it together. Literally, Jesus is supreme over everything. That's what he's saying. This world that we live in, he created this. I want us to take this and put this into some sort of perspective. And so I know some of you are wondering, what's the big yellow ball over here in the corner all service long? I was actually going to do some yoga, no, just kidding. You will never find me doing yoga. If you do, you'll probably find me in the hospital like 10 minutes later. So you're kind of wondering, I'm kind of wondering if this thing will stop rolling. What is this big yellow ball that keeps rolling? I promise it'll sit still at some point. Stop it. There we go. Any guesses what the big yellow ball is? It's a Pilates ball. No, it's a sun. This is the sun, and even though I touched it, my hands didn't burn off. And by the way, be careful, don't stare at it too long, because you'll burn your eyes out. I want you to imagine that this is the sun. Imagine this is the sun. Now the sun, the sun that our planet revolves around, our sun is literally the center of our solar system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about space on 3 different levels. I'm going to talk about our solar system, I'm going to talk about our galaxy, and then I'm going to talk about the universe. The center of our solar system is this thing called the sun. It is a burning, hot, molten lava ball in the sky. We are on a planet that revolves around this. We're actually 93 million miles away from this planet, but I just want to ask a question. Any guess, if this is the sun, relatively speaking, if this is the sun, how big do you think the Earth is in relationship to it? Yeah, it's about the size of this marble. This is our planet in relationship to the sun, right here. Except that we're 93 million miles away from it, so like somewhere over there is where our planet is. I was thinking about this morning. I was thinking, isn't it funny that at one point we thought that was revolving around us? It's kind of funny, isn't it? 93 million miles away, and here we are. Actually, the Earth, if you were to take the Earth and put it inside the sun, you could put 95,000 planet Earths inside the circumference of the sun. That's how small we are. 95 million miles away. What's fascinating is the light and the heat. Like today's going to be a really beautiful day, going to be really warm. When you walk outside, the warmth that you feel on your face left the surface of the sun 8 minutes previous to you feeling it. It's pretty remarkable, isn't it? And here's our planet. Here we are. We're traveling around this thing, moving around it perfectly. Anybody want to see where they are on this? You see? There are 7 billion people on this tiny sphere. 7 billion people. You're one of them, and you're circling this sun. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. If I walk backwards, I feel like I'm going to mess the whole thing up, so I got to go this way. There we go. Whew, don't want to cause any disruptions in the universe, right? So here we are, and this is our solar system. This is our solar system. Our solar system is a part of a galaxy called the Milky Way. Now, the way you can think about this is that the Milky Way is like a neighborhood in the universe. A galaxy is like a neighborhood. It's like a subdivision in the universe. We live in this galaxy called the Milky Way. So this sun and this little tiny planet is in this galaxy called the Milky Way. Now, if you're wondering about the significance of our sun in relationship to the Milky Way, if you took our sun and turned it into this marble, this is still too small as it relates to its reference point in our galaxy. There are millions upon millions upon millions of stars just in our galaxy. And our little star, if this is the galaxy, our little star is this one little spot over here. We're not even at the center of our galaxy, by the way. We're off to the edge somewhere. It's a galaxy that if you were to count all of the stars in our galaxy, all of the stars, and you counted one per second, it would take you 2,500 years to count all the stars. 1, 2, 3, for the next 2,500 years. What if you lost count? That would be a nightmare, right? No! 1, back to 1, right? We measure distance in our galaxy by the speed of light, and technically by light years. So pretty remarkable. A light year, light travels in a year somewhere around 55 trillion miles. So that's pretty far. If you wanted to go from one side of our neighborhood in the galaxy, so where we are over here on our little planet, if you wanted to go visit somebody else that still lives in our neighborhood, it would take you 100,000 years, light years, to get to the other side. 100,000 light years. So here's our sun. If this is our sun, then we're really little here. And it would take, that's just our galaxy. Our galaxy is one of millions of galaxies in the known universe today. Is anybody feeling small right now? Anyone feeling insignificant? This puts this in perspective when you hear the words of Paul, and he says that Jesus made this. Like, we get real fixated on what he's doing right here with this little thing right here, right now. But when you understand the largeness of this, do you recognize what's happening in terms of our view of Jesus? Like, we are right-sizing Jesus when we look at this. We grossly underestimate who he is or his supremacy. When we stop and we look at this and we recognize that the Milky Way, our galaxy, is just one sliver of all that he created, it radically reshapes how we think about God, how we think about Jesus. This is a remarkable way for us to rethink even who we are in relationship to this. Because maybe when you hear what Paul is saying, you realize, I may not be that big of a deal after all. And now I know why thinking I am doesn't really seem to do much. Because I'm pretty small. This is mind-blowing when you think about this. Sometimes I wonder this. There are parts of like the Old Testament, and so here's a question. Is it possible that there were things written in the Bible that would be actually more relevant for future generations? That they would understand that maybe the first generation receiving it would hear something, know it, but that it would actually have more relevance to a future generation? The truth is, in the Old Testament, we see that. There were Old Testament prophets who wrote down prophecies that had a relevance in the context that they were given. But what's fascinating is, a couple thousand years later, they look back and realize, wow, the significance of what was being said was way greater than we ever imagined now that we're in this context. Now, I want you to think about this. Paul talks to the Colossians, and he says that Jesus has created. He's above all things. He has created all things. That was something the church at Colossae could have possibly comprehended at some level. But how about for us? When those words are spoken, what does it mean to be an advanced, technological, scientific, informed culture like ours today? This has radical implications. I mean, we know more about what Paul's talking about than any generation in history. Not only that, there are some really amazing discoveries that are happening right now. There are things that are going on in our world that are radical. I want to share this with you. There's something pretty cool. In fact, so Jesus has made all things, visible and invisible, and Paul continues with this statement in verse 17. Listen to this. This is a really cool thing. This is one of those things that might mess with you, and you might lay in bed tonight thinking about this instead of writing letters to people that work at stores. Colossians 1:17, he says, and he is before all things, and in him all these things hold together. A couple of years ago, physicists discovered this thing called the Higgs boson. The Higgs boson is a particle that was discovered, the super collider. Some of you maybe read about this whole story. The Higgs boson is a particle that its nickname is literally the God particle. Stephen Hawking, noted physicist and well-known atheist, actually, when they began to pursue this to prove that the Higgs boson existed, Stephen Hawking made a bet with another scientist, a $100 bet, because he's a big spender. He said, I will bet you $100 that no scientist ever discovers this. There was an article recently that referenced this, and I want to share this with you. Listen to this said about Hawking. After losing that bet, when physicists detected the particle in 2012, Hawking lamented the discovery, saying it made physics less interesting. But some time goes by, and now listen to what it says. Now, in the preface to a new collection of essays and lectures called Starmus, the famous theoretical physicist is warning that the particle could one day be responsible for the destruction of the known universe. Not very boring anymore, this little particle that we're talking about. Listen to this. Hawking is not the only scientist who thinks so. The theory of a Higgs boson doomsday, where a quantum fluctuation creates a vacuum bubble that expands through space and wipes out the universe, has been around for a while. The article continues. It says this: the Higgs boson is sometimes referred to as the God particle, much to the chagrin of scientists who prefer the official name. Its discovery lends strong support to the standard model of particle physics, which is thought to govern the basic building blocks of matter. The Higgs boson particle is important to the standard model because it signals the existence of something called the Higgs field, an invisible energy field present throughout the universe that imbues other particles with mass. Since its discovery 2 years ago, the particle has been making waves in the physics community. The Higgs boson is about 126 billion electron volts, or about 126 times the mass of a proton. This turns out to be the precise mass needed to keep the universe on the brink of instability. But physicists say the delicate state will eventually collapse and the universe will become unstable. That conclusion involves the Higgs field. And then listen to this statement in this article. The Higgs field emerged at the birth of the universe and has acted as its own source of energy ever since. You can find that on NBCnews.com 9 days ago. Here's Paul writing this letter, and he says, do you understand the majesty of who Jesus is and what he's done? And within the last few weeks, we're reading articles about this dynamic of all things being held together in a way that nobody can understand. They call it the God particle. I would love to call it the Jesus particle. Because verse 17 says, in him all things hold together. For me, when I think about these things, I think about the psalmist in Psalm 8, when he says these words, when I look at your heavens and the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which have been set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? We need to right size Jesus. The bondage in our life, the restriction in our life, the reason our life runs amok is because we have this elevated self-importance or sense of self-importance. And yet Paul in this moment is liberating us. He's saying, look he made this. What is man? Who are you? Who do you think you are? There's this almost humiliating moment as you stand here and go, wow, who do I think I am? But what's fascinating, this is even more amazing, is before Paul says this, before he dives into this whole thing, and this is what's really amazing, before he dives into this and says, look at who Jesus is and all this grandeur, the first sentence that he says in verse 15 is mind-blowing. Look at what it says about Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is the image of if you want to know what God looks like, you look to Jesus. That's what he's saying. Jesus literally is the expression of the invisible God. He shows him to us. So this God that made the universe is revealed in the person of Jesus. If that's the case, what does he show us? What does Jesus show us about God? Think about this. He shows us a God that's compassionate, right? Like in John chapter 8, when there's the woman that's caught in adultery and we see Jesus kneeling down and caring for her in that moment and setting things straight, we see a God who's compassionate, right? We see a God who is incredibly forgiving. In the story of Zacchaeus, this wicked little guy who nobody liked, and we see him approaching him and welcoming him and including him. There's this forgiveness. We see a God who mourns with us When Mary and Martha lose their brother Lazarus and he's dead and Jesus is weeping and he's grieving with them. We see a God who heals illness and infirmity when he walks up to a man that's a leper that nobody had touched for decades and heals him of his leprosy and touches him like nobody had before. That's what Jesus is showing us about our God. That's who he is, this God who is loving and merciful, this God who in Luke chapter 8, when Jesus is with the disciples on the lake and a storm kicks up, has incredible power, the ability to quell the storm. Like unbelievable what Jesus reveals about God. We could go on and on and on, and you realize that all of these actions and activities of Jesus, every one of those stories is pointing us to the God who created this. And for me, there's this moment when I realize, like, we live in a culture today where there are people in churches that want to separate Jesus from the church, and the activities of the church, and like, well, let's just keep you in the church, but let's not talk about Jesus a whole lot. There are people that want to separate the church from the cross, or they want to separate even deity from Jesus. Like, well, there's Jesus and his teachings, and that's one thing, but this whole, like, is Jesus God thing. My question is this: when Jesus is the one revealing God to us, and we see God being revealed in him, as Paul says, why in the world would anybody reject the deity of Christ? Like, why? Why would you say, let's separate the two? Why would we question? Why would we be offended by this? Why would we be offended by an individual like Jesus, who is showing us a God who is far more loving and compassionate and full of grace than we ever imagined? Why? Here's why. Because you can't look at Jesus and not realize how small you are. You can't. Because eventually you look at Jesus and you read these stories and you open up to Colossians, and there is something that speaks to our hearts that says, you're incredibly small. And your smallness, when you recognize it, is offensive, isn't it? Isn't there a part of you, because we've been working so hard to find our significance and our self-worth, that when somebody says you're small, you go, oh, and you rise up against it? The irony of the gospel is this, though. We may realize our smallness, but our smallness does not determine our significance. In fact, the opposite in the gospel is true, and this is where the power is. The power of the gospel is that we may be small, but the gospel actually says we are way more significant, far more significant than we ever could have imagined. The gospel speaks volumes to us about what Christ has done for us. Look at how he continues, and he goes on. In verse 21, Paul moves from this. He moves from this presentation of our smallness and Christ's supremacy, and then he says, and you who once were alienated and hostile in mind, you messed up, small individuals doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. He's saying, listen, you may be small, but you are a big deal to God. It's like he puts these two in contrast with one another. Do you realize how significant Jesus is? Do you recognize his power over the universe? And then do you see what he's done for you? That the God of the universe has done what he's done for you, that Jesus has come to redeem you, to make relationship with this God a reality? Do you see the significance? That's what Paul is saying in this. The gospel frees us. The gospel frees us to be a very small, very big deal. You are small, but you are a big deal. The cross proclaims that to you. So ironically, we become humbled and we become confident at the same time. We become supremely confident. So confident that suddenly the opinions of others, or even our old efforts of discovering self-worth or value, they just look insignificant. They look like they don't even matter compared to the significance that we find in Christ. We find ourselves in a place of humility as we acknowledge Jesus and say, look at you, and look at what you've done for me. That changes everything, doesn't it?